Hi, welcome to tutorial number 2 on the MitMac Games channel. Now in tutorial number 1, we went over getting started with Unity. We created some basic objects, went over the UI, and created some basic materials. Now, unless you want your game just to have cubes, planes, and spheres, you're going to need another program in order to create some more interesting game objects. And that's where Blender comes in. In this tutorial, we're going to be going over getting started with Blender. Blender is an open source free program, free to download, but it contains a lot of different functionality. I'm going to be focusing on just the functionality to create game objects. So in this tutorial, I'm going to go over just the basics on creating some basic game objects, assigning some materials to them, and importing them into Unity, going over that whole process. So I'm going to put my game programming glasses on and let's get started. All right, the first thing we're going to want to do is launch Blender. As you can see, I am running Blender version 2.93. As of this recording, they have come out with 3.0, but I haven't upgraded yet. So all my examples, I'm going to be using Blender 2.93. The first thing we're going to want to do is just select a general drawing. Now, the thing is, when working in 3D objects, what we have to remember is that my mouse is traveling in a 2D plane, but I'm going to want to be creating 3D objects. So we're not going to be drawing objects like maybe you would do in Paint or a program like that, but we're going to be manipulating an existing 3D object. Now, the first object that we get when we launch a brand new Blender file is what's called the default cube. Simply a cube in the middle of the screen. We can see two lines here. The greenish yellow line represents the y-axis, and the red line represents the x-axis, and z-axis is up. If you remember of the Unity tutorial, in Unity y is up, but here in Blender z is up. And when we export objects, we'll see why we have to take that into account when exporting out of Blender into Unity. Now, there's a lot of functions in Blender, and I'm not going to go over them all. In fact, some of them we won't use at all because they're used for things other than what we're interested in. And what we're interested in is creating game objects. So the first thing I want to go over is these items up in the top of the screen. So we're currently in the layout mode. In this mode, we can generally see one large window with our game objects, and we're generally going to use this in order to manipulate our game objects. One of the most important things to know is the difference between object mode and edit mode. In object mode, we select the whole object. And in edit mode, we can select different parts of the object. Which parts of the object we're going to be selecting are controlled by these three icons here. In this one, I can select individual vertices. In this mode, I can select individual edges. And in this mode, I can select individual faces. Now, the one thing about Blender, and if you've ever watched Blender videos, is most people are going to use shortcuts to change between these modes. And it's a good idea to learn the shortcuts. You don't have to. You can use pretty much anything that you can see a shortcut for. You can find a menu for. But especially the ones that are used a lot, it's very handy to know the shortcuts. And the shortcuts here to switch between edit and object mode is tab. And in order to see my keys, I'm going to turn on the screencast keys so you can see the keys that I'm selecting. So N is actually the shortcut to pop that menu in and out. So now if I click tab, you'll see it's toggling between object mode and edit mode. And what's important to note is that certain functions and menus are only accessible in edit mode, and some are only accessible in object mode. And it's one of the confusing things that I found when watching the videos is that I didn't realize this and couldn't figure out why I wasn't seeing the same menu options on my screen as the video I was following. The other is to switch between the vertex, edge, and face mode. We use the numbers on your keyboard. So if I press 1, it's going to select the vertex select, 2 is going to select edge, and 3 is going to select face. And we toggle between these a lot, so knowing those 3 are very handy also. The other thing you'll notice is that each of these windows has different things showing in it. And this icon in the upper left-hand corner, and if we click this little drop down, we can see we can actually change what's in this view to any one of these items. By selecting layout view, they select a default for us. Now, one thing that I generally don't like is that this bottom window is showing this animation playback, and I'm never really working on animations in layout mode. So I'm going to change this to the shader editor instead. So when we make materials, we can kind of see the details about that. The other thing to note is that on the bottom of the screen, it shows me what my options are here. So the left button in this case has select. I can click it and move it for box select. I can do my middle mouse button to rotate my view, and the right mouse button is going to pop up a menu. And every time we select something, different options are going to pop up on the bottom of the screen. So that can help you know what your options are at that point in your editing. Another very important thing to note is this window in the upper right hand corner. This is going to show us all the objects that we currently have in our drawing. And currently we have one object, which is the cube. And that object has a mesh, which is also default called cube. It has a camera, which is indicated by this icon over here. And it has a light, which is indicated by this drawing here. And we're not going to do a lot with those for now, but just wanted to point that out. And here is all our properties of our object. And there's lots of different properties, and we're just going to be going over some basics for the video today. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and make some basic manipulations of this object to bring into Unity. And I'm going to make a very specific object to highlight the importance of bringing objects and materials into Unity. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select my cube. I'm going to go into object mode, hit tab, and I'm going to come over here to this icon here, which is setting the material properties. And right now it's given a default material. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very simple material, and I'm going to call it red. Similar to what we created a material in Unity in the first tutorial. And I'm going to change the color here from white to red. All right, there we go. So now we have a new material, red, but you'll notice that the cube is still white. Now this is another shortcut key. I'm going to press the Z key, and that's going to pop up this little menu, and it's going to show me how my view is set up. And I can, right now it's in solid view. I can click wireframe view, or what I'm going to use is rendered view. So basically it's going to show me all the objects on my screen like it's rendered. The important thing to note is that this is using the Unity or Blender render, not the Unity render, and they're totally independent from each other. So exactly how it looks in Blender, it's not going to look exactly the same way in Unity. And it's very important to note that we want it to look as close as possible when we're making it, to make sure that how we're creating our objects are going to be similar to how they're viewed in Unity. So basically what we have is we have a red cube with a material called red. And what we're going to do is we're going to export this into Unity, the most basic of objects. So we have a cube, What we're going to do to export is we're going to go to File. We are going to go to Export. We are going to export it as an FBX format. So we're going to select FBX. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to export it. But how are we going to get it into Unity? Well, there's a couple different ways of getting it into Unity. One way is to save it directly into the folder that we want to bring it into. But how do we know where that is in our file system? Well, what we can do, and I just brought up our Unity project, and if you watch tutorial 1, you'll recognize this is the project we created. I'm going to right-click on Assets, and I'm going to click Show in Explorer. And what that's going to do is it's going to show me where in my hard drive this Assets folder is. I'm going to double-click on it here. Get a little bigger. What I'm going to do is this is the path of exactly where all my assets are saved. We can see our images folder, our materials folder, our scenes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy, Control-C. I never type what I can copy in general. It's just a lot easier. I'm going to go back to my Blender. I'm going to highlight the path. I'm going to hit Control-V to paste. Hit return, and now I have the exact location of my assets folder. And I'm going to say export. Come back to my Unity project. And now you'll notice that I have an object called Untitled because I didn't give it actually a name of my file. So the name as it appears in Unity is going to be whatever file name that I used when exporting, and I didn't give it a name and it just came up the default, but that's okay. So you'll notice when I expand this, what I see. I see camera, cube, light, red, cube. I see lots of things in this object. It brought in everything from my Blender scene, including my camera, cube, light, my material, and this little icon represents the actual mesh, which is really what I wanted. And I also did want a material. So let's click this and drag it onto our scene. And we can see that when I drag this on, I got my camera, my lights, and I got 2 cameras and 2 lights, which I didn't really want. So let's select this. Let's delete this. Let's figure out how to fix that. Let's go back to Blender. Let's export this again. FBX. And what we're going to do is we're going to select this checkbox, which just says only limit it to only the objects I have selected. We can see I have the cube selected. And I am going to export it again. Delete that. I still didn't give it a name. So now all I have is a material and I have the cube mesh. I can drag it on here. And now I have my cube. So when I select this, let's select one of our other cubes here. Let's go to the materials. The one thing that when I bring this in, when I see my list of all the materials, what I see is I see 2 red materials. So why do I see 2 here? Well, the thing is that I already had a material called red, which is right here. You'll notice this is actually a different color red. And in my imported item, I also have a red material. So that means every time I bring different new objects in, it's going to bring the materials in. And in this case, I could have multiple materials all with the same name that may look slightly different. And this is confusing. So how do I get rid of that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this item, the top level object. And I can see I have some options here. One is materials. You'll notice on-demand remap. What I can do is I can remap the material, get rid of the material that came in with it, with the material that I already have in Unity. So I'm going to select the red. I'm going to drag it on top of here. I'm going to click apply. Now let's pop up our little UI. Now you'll see that the other red material went away because it replaced the one that I brought in with the material in Unity. And that's what we're going to do in general, is we're always going to replace the material that came in with the material that's in Unity to avoid getting lots of materials that are very similar, could be the same name but be different. Again, we want to keep things clean as we move forward. So now we've gone over kind of the process of exporting from Blender a very basic object, a cube, and handling the materials of that object, at least a very simple material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this. Keep it clean. Let's go back to Blender. Now what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate an object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this cube. So one confusing thing that I found confusing is the delete key does not delete things in Blender. Actually, you want to hit the X key to delete an object. Now I want to add a new object into my scene. I could come up here and click on add, but you notice it shows my shortcut, which is Shift A. So we're going to use the Shift A key. We are going to add a cube. So we got rid of a cube that was assigned a material, and I added a new cube, and you'll see why I did that in a minute. So what I'm going to do is now go over a couple of the other basic commands. The first command is the scale command. So these items over here generally execute a lot of these functions, but again, I'm going to use the shortcut key, and I'm going to press S for scale. Now, when I press S, you'll notice that it drew a dotted line from where my cursor was to where my object was. I'm going to right click to cancel that. And this is important too. So now you'll notice if my cursor is very close to the center of the object and I hit scale, it's very touchy. And I generally don't want to have my cursor very close to the center point when I go to execute any of these commands to manipulate my object. I'm going to right click the mouse, which will cancel out of that command. I'm going to move my cursor over here. Now I'm going to hit scale, but what I want to do is flatten out this box, because what we're going to do is we're going to draw an arrow. I want to manipulate this box into an arrow shape, and what I want to do is flatten it, which means I want to scale it in the Z direction. Now there's a couple ways to do that. The way that I usually do it is I press scale. What I'm going to do is you'll see along the bottom I have lots of options. And you can see near the left-hand side there's the X, Y, Z. So I can limit it to just the Z axis by clicking Z. And now when I move my cursor closer, it's going to flatten out that cube, which is exactly what I want. Now what I'm going to do is I want to rotate to see this from a different angle. So what I'm going to do to rotate it, again, you can see my options down here, is I'm going to press the middle button, and I'm going to move around so I can kind of see the front face of it. What I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to toggle into edit mode, so I'll hit tab. Now I'm in edit mode. I am in face select mode, so I'm going to collect this face here. What I'm going to do is I want to stretch it out or pull it forward. So I'm going to do G for grab. Again, this is another very common, probably the most used shortcut key of any of them. And I just want to grab it in the Y direction. So I'm going to click Y and I'm going to stretch it out. Now what I'm going to want to do is I want to stretch this wider to be the wide part of my arrow. So I can scale this. I want to scale it along the X axis. So if I hit S and scale it. Well, that's not really what I wanted because I don't want the side to stretch to my larger scale size. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to cancel out of this, right click. What I want to do is I want to extrude this. I want to create a new set of faces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude it, E for extrude, but I'm not going to move it anywhere. I'm simply going to left click. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it. And now you'll see the extrude created a new face for me to scale wider. So I'm going to scale that wider. I'm going to change my view here. Now what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to extrude that face like this. I'm going to extrude again to be the point. And now what I want to do is I want to scale this down to a point. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to scale again in the X direction. S for scale. I'm going to shrink it down. And I really want it to be very, very small. But how do I get it exactly? I want it to be a 0 width. So you'll notice that every time I was doing one of these functions, you'll notice that a little menu popped up in the lower left hand corner, and if I open that up, it lets me type in values for my whatever command I did. In this case it's a resize. What I want to do is I want to change the X scale just to 0. So now it's a perfect point in the X direction. I could have changed the Y and the Z to 0. Well, I guess it would just be the Z to be a point, but this is good enough. So now what I have is I have my arrow. Now what I want to do is I want to see which way is up and which way is down for my arrow. So what I'm going to want to do is I want a little post that sticks up from my arrow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use I for inset. You notice I mistakenly made this too close to the cursor, right? I do this a lot. So I'll right click, move my cursor away, click I, make it about that size. You'll notice my little menu pops up. That gives me lots of different options for inset. Gonna shrink that down. Now I don't want it this wide. What I want is a post that shows up about right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change to edge select mode. I'm going to select this edge. I'm going to grab along the Y axis. I'm going to drag it here to be our little post. Toggle back to face select mode by hitting 3. Select my face. Extrude. Extrude is always going to extrude along the normal of the face. The normal is always pointing perpendicular, right, to the plane of the face. Talk a little bit more about that as we get into some more of the detail modeling. So now I have what I want. I have my arrow, I have my post sticking straight up. So now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to assign this arrow to a material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to object mode. Going to come down here to our materials. I'm going to create a new material, but instead of making just a color, I'm going to map this to an image. So if you see any games that you probably played, there's lots and lots of cool looking graphics and scenes and characters and buildings and landscapes, and those are all because they've mapped complex images onto their meshes. In this case, we're going to keep this low poly. All my games that I'll be demonstrating, we going to call what's called low poly, which is a small number of polygons. Each one of these faces is a polygon, and map them to pretty simple colors. I'm not an artist, and I don't have the capabilities of creating some of those fancy graphics. So low poly are pretty easy to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to want to assign it to an image. And how we do that is instead of clicking this solid color, I'm going to click this little dot next to it. And that's going to pop up a menu. And I'm going to select image texture. Now it turned black because it doesn't have an image. I haven't grabbed a texture yet. So I'm going to click this open. and I am going to go to the same folder as I had my other tutorial examples that we did in tutorial 1, and one of these is an image I created called Low Poly Palette. I'm going to click Open Image, and now we see our object just changed to lots of different colors. It did this because what we need to do is we need to map each one of these vertices to some part of the image texture that we brought in. And how we do that is we go to this UV editing. When we click this, what we did is we see this is the image that I assigned to my material. And what we see when we click on different objects here is this is the default mapping that it assigned to our image texture. And I don't want any of these. What I want is all of these to map to a single, one of the single colors in my palette. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the A key here. We're just going to select everything, and we can now see all our objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click here, and one of the options is UV unwrap faces. What I want to do is I want to reset the faces to a different configuration. And you see there's a number of options. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this reset. So what this does is it reset all the points to be the maximum size in our image. What I'm going to do is I'm going to left click over here, and I'm going to box in all of our points, and it shows those selected. I'm going to use my same S key for scale, and I'm going to scale these down so they'll fit inside of one of these boxes. I'm going to use G for grab, and I'm going to drag it to one of our colors. I'm going to drag it coincidentally just to this light gray area. Now when I come over here, I'm going to press Z so I can see it in the rendered mode, and you can see now it is rendered in our gray area. So just to be clear what happened, I'm going to select all of them again. I'm going to select these. I'm going to say G for grab, and you'll notice as I move it, you can see it is going to change the rendered color on my preview. But I don't want this all to be gray. What I want is the post to be red. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a face over here. What I want to do is I want to select all the faces on this post. One way to do that is to hold down the Alt key. You'll notice down in the lower left-hand corner it shows Loop Select. So now when I select my face, what it did is it selected everything in the loop around my post. I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and I'm going to select the top. Holding down the Shift key will add whatever I selected to my selection set. So now I have all my faces selected. And you'll see that they're showing over here. And now I'm going to say G for grab, and I'm going to grab them to red. I'm going to come back to my layout mode. So now I have my arrow, and I have my red post, and it kind of shows up. So now I can tell the direction that my object is facing, and what is up and what is down. So I'm going to come over here, and now we're going to export this. I'm going to click Export, FBX. It remembered my last selection, which was just selected objects. And we're going to change this name from untitled. I'm going to name it Arrow. It defaulted to the same place that I was before, which is our assets folder, which is where I want it. I'm going to export it. Come back over here to Unity, and we see our arrow appeared. Now I'm going to drag it here. Now you'll notice that when I selected it, it has a rotation of -89.98 degrees. It has a scale of some size, which is because I had transformed it. But what I really want to do is I want to bring it in with 0 rotation. And what I really want is the scales to be 1. But that's not what I got. Also, when I look at this, I can see that my material did not come in. It's not, it doesn't have my low poly material. So I can select this and I can see when I select my arrow, I can see my material here. The problem is that it doesn't have my low poly palette image. If I did have the image, it would map it. I haven't brought it into images yet. And this is another confusion, is that when you're watching videos and they bring in a material, that if they already have the images to match up, the material will just come in. But in this case, I didn't. But I really don't want to use the material anyway. Remember, we want to replace the material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my low poly palette image so I can create a new material to remap that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my tutorial samples, grab my low poly palette. And you'll remember from the first one, I can just drag it right in here, similar to my first tutorial. Now I have my low poly palette image, hard to say. Now what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to create a new material, create material, grab my graphic onto albedo. I'm going to want to rename this to low poly palette. Oops. Let's spell it correctly. I don't even know if that's how you spell palette. All right. So we have our material. We'll go to our arrow. We'll go to our material, and we are going to drag this onto here. I'm going to apply it, and lo and behold, our object shows up correctly. I'm going to click save. Anytime I do anything, I like to save along the way. Never know when something's going to crash. All right. So now when I select my object, what I see is we see our element. You'll notice that in this case, our blue or Z direction is pointing up instead of the direction that we want it to. So that's because this object's been rotated, and I don't want that. So let's select our arrow. Let's delete it. Let's come back into Blender. Let's export it again. You notice there's another checkbox I didn't have, which is apply transform. So what I want to do is I want to apply the transform to make Z forward and Y up, because that's how Unity works. So now when I click export, come back into here, change our rotation to 0, and now Y is up. But the problem is what we want is we want Z forward to be pointing in the direction of our arrow, but it's not. It's pointing in the opposite direction. So which way is forward and which way is back is also important. And yeah, I could fix this. I could rotate it 180 degrees around the Y-axis, but I want a clean and very understood way of bringing objects from Blender into Unity. So we're going to fix this. So let's select our arrow. Let's delete it. Let's come back into Blender. And now what we're going to want to do is we want to rotate this around the Z-axis. So we are going to select this. We're going to come over here. There's a couple different ways of rotating it. I can click rotate. I could type in the rotation around here since We haven't shown it through the keyboard. I'm going to click R for rotate, Z for the Z axis, and we're going to rotate it right around there. It's pretty close. Now you'll notice that our Z axis over here is 181. I'm going to come over here and just type 180. All right. So now we are going to export FBX. It remembered everything, apply transform, selected objects. Good to go. Come over here, select our arrow. Oops. Did I delete that? Let's try this again. You'll notice Z 180, file, export, FBX, export, Unity. Oh, because it zeroed out the rotation. So you'll see that still didn't fix our problem. So let's delete it. Let's come in here. So what we're going to do is we are going to come into select our object. We are going to right click. We don't see the selection we want. We're going to select this, tab into edit view. Oops. A for all. And we are going to actually want to go to, oh, nope, it's not in edit mode. It is in object mode. Object, apply. Going to want to apply all transforms. So what it did is it took all the transforms we did. Remember, we didn't actually change the object. We're simply applying transforms to it. But now, by applying transforms, we actually modified the mesh to basically zero out all of the rotations and all the scale factors and actually apply them to the mesh itself. So now what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to go to File, Export, FBX, Arrow, Export, grab our arrow, drag it on, and now our arrow is exactly correct. It's pointing into positive Z direction. Y is up, you can tell by our post. So that's exactly what we want. And we have our material. Now remember, it brought the material in, but it remembered it because we had this low poly palette already there. So you'll notice I didn't have to remap the material. But I'm actually going to do that anyway. I'm going to select this. I'm going to grab our low poly palette. I'm going to have to select this arrow again. Grab this guy, drag it on there, apply it. So now we'll just have one low poly palette. All right. Now we have our object in here, but what we want to do is we want to create a prefab out of this. I'm going to come over here, I'm going to delete it. I'm going to come over here, we're going to delete that guy. I'm going to grab my arrow that I brought in. I'm going to drag it on like we did before. Now you'll notice that I don't see the breakdown. Here I can see the mesh. I don't see it here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this, I'm going to drag it over here. And it's going to give me an option. I'm going to click Original Prefab. So now I have an arrow, which is a prefab of my imported item. Now I can't delete this because this is actually simply a reference to this arrow. So I need to keep this around. So what I generally do is I create a folder to put all my imported meshes. I'm going to right click, create folder. I'm going to call this imports. I'm going to grab that arrow that I imported and drag it in here because I really don't want or need to mess around with those imports. And this arrow and cube, I want to put those in a folder too. So I'm going to right click here, create folder, and I'm going to call this meshes, because really these are my game objects, the actual meshes of my game objects. So I'm going to grab this arrow, I'm going to drag it in here, grab my cube, drag it in there. So now we have our meshes, which is our objects. And meshes, we're calling them meshes because really it's all those vertex points. And you'll see there's other game type objects we can create later that are not specific mesh game objects. All right, so what we have shown is how to go into Blender, make a basic object, manipulate it. Again, lots of other commands to do more sophisticated objects. We've assigned materials to this. We've shown plain materials, which are just colors, and in our low poly palette material, how to map an image, how to do some basic UV editing, bring it into Unity, make it show up correctly. You'll notice now when I select this, our rotation is 0, 0, 0. Our scale is 1, 1, 1, which is exactly what we want. Everything nice and clean. All right, so that was the basics of using Blender to create game objects and bring them into Unity. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and I'll be creating more tutorials on scripting next, making our game objects do things, and then get into more sophisticated processes of how to start putting together something a little more interesting.